I'm Molly Nance, your moderator for the second webinar in this series on farmer-led irrigation development. I'm also Director of Communications with the Daugherty Water for Food Global Institute, or DWFI, at the University of Nebraska. And we are delighted to co-host this webinar with our partners, the International Water Management Institute, the World Bank, and GWP. We're excited to receive more than 900 registrations from over 100 countries and 600 plus organizations showing the global interest of policymakers, social enterprises, private sector companies, development partners, and researchers on this topic. As you'll notice in the webinar, all attendees are muted. However, we encourage you to ask questions or share your comments using the chat feature. You will find the chat menu button in the lower left corner of your webinar screen. This event is being recorded, and we will email you the link to the video along with other resources shortly after the event. To save time, I will introduce our presenters briefly before their presentations. You will find their bios in the link Julianne just put into the chat. To kick off our webinar, I would like to introduce Pieter McCornick, Executive Director of DWFI. Pieter?
Thank you, Molly. Good morning from Nebraska, and good afternoon and evening for those of you joining from much further east. Thank you all for engaging in this series of webinars on farmer-led irrigation. It is very inspiring to see the level of participation today, especially quite a number of new names that have not been involved to date in these virtual events. Truly, yes, a global event, but certainly more close to acting locally. As was mentioned in the first webinar, the concept of farmer-led irrigation has been around for decades, arguably centuries. More recently, there's been a number of important efforts to learn lessons and strengthen the knowledge base to systematically improve the inclusivity, the productivity, scaling out, and sustainability of this important opportunity for resilient food and agricultural systems. Recognizing that much has and is being done by the farm communities themselves, and acknowledging the ongoing of past efforts and the progress in developing our understanding of this topic, the challenge we really face is translating this into tangible outcomes on the ground beyond specific investments to date. To this end, an important development was the International Forum on Water for Food in early 2018, which was co-hosted by the World Bank and the Daugherty Water for Food Global Institute, along with USAID, USDA, IWMI, IFPRI, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and other partners. Significantly was these partners coming together, but more importantly was the participation of public and private sector leaders from agriculture and water, including many from African countries. This was acknowledged at the time as an important outcome in the journey, and yet it was recognized there was more to do, especially in including and supporting partners closer to the field. The challenge ahead is to continue the progression of listening to, including and supporting those assuming the risks, that is the farmers, those working in the input and output value chains, and the communities that are key to sustaining the resources we'll hear more about today. How do we successfully catalyze the uptake of productive, sustainable, and inclusive farmer-led irrigation beyond well-resourced pilot and specific programs? We at DWFI certainly are keen to continue our support to this evolving partnership. Again, welcome and thank you.
Thanks very much, Pieter. And now I'd like to introduce Pieter Repinski, the Acting Executive Secretary of the Global Water Partnership.
Thank you very much indeed, and dear esteemed speakers and participants. It is truly an honor for me to address you today in the context of the webinar series on farmer-led irrigation development. Farmer-led irrigation can offer viable solutions for enhancing food and water security, climate resilience, livelihoods, and economic development for resource-poor farmers around the globe, facing simultaneous health, economic, and climate shocks. And all of this, all the more important as we are confronted with health, economic, and environmental crises hitting the poorest the hardest. The development of farmer-led irrigation can and should be further accelerated And we at GWP have been actively engaging with multiple stakeholders in several countries to scale these interventions. But we also see that governance and management systems are generally lagging. Investment supporting farmer-led irrigation will not be effective, sustainable, and inclusive without concurrent investments in formal institutions and community governance. Our organization, GWP, was founded more than 20 years ago with a strong conviction that improving water governance at all scales is key to sustainable and equitable development. And that to do so, we need to work together and adopt integrated approaches from a systems perspective. This may require innovative and different partnerships, investments to support sustainability, and exploring formal and informal governance structures. We are therefore very pleased to contribute to this webinar series to collectively explore how to really upscale farmer-led irrigation in practice, with a focus on how to do so in a sustainable and inclusive manner. I wish you a very interesting and thought-provoking discussion, and I look forward to actively pursuing these efforts through continued engagement in farmer-led irrigation initiatives within the GWP network and our partners. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. And now our third Peter, to provide a summary of the last webinar that we had, I'd like to introduce Pieter Waalewijn, who is the Global Lead for Water and Agriculture with the World Bank Global Water Practice. He'll provide key messages on the first webinar, which was held June 11th. And you may watch that webinar recording online, along with other related resources at the link provided in the chat box. Pieter?
Yes, hi everybody. I'm skipping my video. My connection keeps breaking again. So, and it happened last webinar if you were there, but it was a great successful webinar on June 11th. We had people participating from 66 countries, and that showed not only the interest, but also the relevance of this topic globally. And the topic of the first webinar was accelerating inclusive farmer-led irrigation development and reaching scale. And there was one block which was talking about the understanding of FLI and the enabling environment. And the second block was on business models, finance modalities, and social inclusion. And the key takeaways from that first session were, first, providing the clarification on what farmer-led irrigation development really means and how it relates to other types of irrigation development. And where we saw farmer-led irrigation as a process rather than a typology, where farmers drive the establishment and the improvement and the management and or expansion of irrigated agriculture. And it underlined the relevance of farmer-led irrigation in supporting livelihoods and enhancing resilience to climate change and underpinning economic development. And we noted some of the systemic barriers to upscaling FLI on financing, on policy frameworks, on the socioeconomic environment that excludes access to some social groups and regions, markets, land and water availability, land rights, water rights, and the access to technology and information. And then we heard from all of you in the chat and in the polls and from the discussants and on the key elements of building an enabling environment for upscaling sustainable farmer-led irrigation development. And that links to recognizing it in irrigation policy and strategy. So that's a change in mindset away from something that is being frowned upon to something that can be encouraged. Business models that encourage entrepreneurship. Innovative financing mechanisms. We had some example on smart subsidies for solar irrigation. Ensuring social inclusion, inclusive regulatory frameworks on water rights, obligations, and creating partnerships in multi-stakeholder platforms. And we heard from all participants on the major obstacles and innovations. And then overall, the debate is still out on what the role is for each different stakeholders and NGOs, governments, financiers, researchers, and how we can best package all this in comprehensive support systems, and what will constitute success. And that requires a major rethink of support systems to guide rather than drive and control development. And if we are successful in that, then the remaining question becomes the sustainability of all this. And that leads us to the topic of today. And with that, this is the last Pieter that you will hear speaking today, I think. And over back to you, Molly. Thanks.
Thank you, Pieter. Thank you for setting the stage. Our next speakers will present their perspectives on sustainability, monitoring, and multi-scale approaches. Please add your questions or comments to the chat during their presentations. The first is Armand Houanye, Executive Secretary of GWP West Africa, sharing the perceptions from West Africa on the sustainability of FLI development, the role of institutions, and multi-scale approaches. Followed by Petra Schmitter, the Global Lead for Sustainable and Resilient Food Production Systems with the International Water Management Institute, known as IWMI, who will discuss considerations on water availability, abstraction behaviors, and scale when accelerating FLI. Just a reminder to please add your questions to the chat, and we will select a couple of them to address following their presentations. Armand, would you please begin?
Thank you, Molly. Good afternoon, everyone from West Africa in Burkina Faso. I will start in stressing that the development of the small-scale irrigation is critical for improving agricultural productivity, which remains low, and for achieving food security in West Africa. Unfortunately, this is facing critical challenges related to the access to water across the year, the access to irrigation technologies, and the low-cost energy for pumping water, the inefficient water use, the water pollution, and the land degradation and climate change impacts. Through its work, GWP is contributing to address those broader systemic issues in connecting key stakeholders across water, agriculture, energy, environment sectors in using holistic and multi-scale approaches in West Africa countries, including Burkina Faso. Next slide. Next slide. I will be now sharing with you some specific insights from the work of GWP in West Africa. The first relates to the importance of bridging the knowledge gaps. For example, in the Nakabe Some Basin in Burkina Faso, GWP supported a mandated national institution, the Water Agency of Nakambe, and key stakeholders to understand the vulnerability of the agriculture sector to climate change impacts. And then the small-scale irrigation development was identified as a priority adaptation option. Second, relate to the importance of the partnership and working at the institutional level to enhance the conducive enabling environment focusing on policy development. GWP team up with partners, including UNDP, to support Burkina Faso to develop its national adaptation plan, which considers water security measures and the small-scale irrigation development as a priority climate change adaptation pathways. The third is about the need to work at the community level, which is very important as well. So in designing and implementing local demonstration solutions to enhance community resilience, it is critical to involve all stakeholders, including key decentralized institutions, local authorities, and municipalities. The picture you can see here are from the village of Ramintiga, where a local association of 20 farmers owning a borehole was supported to establish a drip irrigation system using a solar energy to pump water. The approach was supported the uptake of the agroecological practice as key pathways to sustain small-scale irrigation. And based on this experience, we appreciate the decision made by the municipality of Lumbila to upscale and sustain the small-scale irrigation development through providing technologies to the farmers. The last slide. To conclude, I would like to share with the audience the following key lessons and message. The first, the importance of knowledge for actions through understanding the vulnerability of the agriculture sector to climate change impacts, and to prioritize the small-scale irrigation development in the national adaptation plans as long-term national planning documents, like what was done in Burkina Faso. Second, it makes sense also to promote the use of integrated basin approaches, considering all current water uses, including their interlinkages and sustainable use levels. Third, ensuring the local commitment from decentralized institutions and stakeholders from upfront. And this helps to address critical connected issues such as those related to the land tenures. Finally, in West Africa, I see that the farmer-led irrigation development cannot happen, or not at the pace needed and in a sustainable and inclusive manner without a supportive, enabling environment. For example, there is a need for supporting investment to assess technologies, at least in early stage, and promoting at the same time sustainable agricultural development and water use. Thank you, Molly, and over to you.
Thank you, Armand. And you're up next, Petra.
Thanks, Molly. So what are some of the considerations that we can make today to protect the most vulnerable and the ecosystem, whilst fulfilling on the promise to support agricultural economic development? First of all, we need to quantify what is available, what is used, and not only in agriculture, but across sectors, and not only now, but in the future. We need to understand climate tipping points and where farmer-led irrigation is and likely remains feasible. And this means that we need to take into account water availability, but also the rising evaporative demands. Research by IWMI with the Innovation Lab for Small-Scale Irrigation has identified, for example, a potential of over 1 million hectares in Ghana for solar-based irrigation expansion using shallow groundwater. However, the climate analysis revealed that 10% of the irrigable land would become unsuitable by 2050 as evapotranspiration increased and water resources declined. This highlights not only that conjunctive use of surface and shallow groundwater resources will be key, but also that development of farmer-led irrigation in some areas might be risky. So we use the water accounting framework to assess what is currently used and what could be further available to support solar-based irrigation and expansion in subbasins. Water accounting provides information on water use in agriculture and by other sectors, and it includes the provision for environmental flows in a given basin. And by combining this with climate scenarios, we can start unpacking climate-associated risks for farmer-led irrigation investments. And this brings me to my second point. We require information at a much higher resolution to support communities and individual households when making these investment decisions. So through citizen science in Ethiopian highlands, for example, we learned that shallow groundwater and hill slope aquifers only is available 3 to 6 months post-rainy season. And depending on where the farmer is with his or her well in the landscape, it would influence the area, the crop choices, but also the irrigation investment that these farmers could make. So we need to zoom in. And how can we fill some of these data gaps? At IWMI, we have partnered with Future Pump to explore how data from solar pumps can be used to identify abstraction patterns for agriculture as well as non-agricultural purposes. There is a huge potential in filling these crucial data gaps and understand trends and dynamics of groundwater resources and how these are influenced by climate change. But this would require us to start building those databases now. And as not all water in rural areas goes to irrigation, we do need to understand if and when and how farmer-led irrigation expands and how this influences the availability of water for domestic needs as well. Because in many of these countries, we just know too little. And this brings me to my last point. We can monitor, but how do we adapt and improve? Technologies to improve water management on farm is not always enough. Groundwater tables do continue to decline in many regions. And as there are many wells and many households, coordinated and collective action to water governance will be key. And we will hear more about that later from Barbara and Claudia. We need a holistic approach, which is adaptive and which includes incentives within food systems and social learning to create a behavioral change. A behavioral change in the way we use our water resources for agriculture as well as other purposes. We have seen that despite, for example, a large uptake in drip in Jordan, groundwater tables continue to drop. And farmers who experienced water scarcity in the past were more likely to over-irrigate than those who didn't experience water scarcity. And this is not the only example out there. So what can we do? We need to strengthen traditional and digital extension services on water and land practices as farmer-led irrigation expands. And this can be done through both public and private sector investments. And there are some really good examples out there. In Ethiopia and Ghana, we introduced irrigation learning tools, as you can see here in the picture. They're called a wetting front detector. And after one season, farmers adapted their irrigation practices because the tool helped them to identify whether water was still sufficient in the root zone. And this resulted not only in a reduction in water application, but also a reduction in fuel consumption, fertilizer use, and an increase in marketable yields up to 30%. Now, combining this with some of the examples we will hear later by Shilp and Dave, we really could trigger adaptive management and make each water drop allocated to agriculture count. However, effects on fields do not translate into larger scale impacts, and farmers move sometimes to more water demanding crops or expand their irrigated areas or cropping intensity. And this brings me back to the first point. We do need to monitor and assess water availability and use across scales, and we need to continuously adapt our behavior and improve our water governance to really transform our food systems. Thank you, Molly.
Thank you both, Armand and Petra, for sharing your experiences on how we need a coordinated approach on monitoring and adaptive management across scales. We've selected a couple of questions from our audience. A question for Armand on the community level experience. Where the local association of 20 farmers establishes a solar pumped borehole system, does each have a separate individual enterprise? And what are the land use rights for such a grouped technical solution? Armand?
Thank you. So that is in a village of Ramitika of the local, that is a local association of the 20 farmers. It is not a separate individual enterprise, that is a collective enterprise established at the village level. And the land is a property of one of them. Okay, so the land is the property of one of the members of the association. Okay. So they agree on how to use the land, and there was an agreement that was established at the beginning of the process to secure the land. Thank you.
Thank you, Armand. And for Petra, do farmers in the individual farms in which they irrigate using water from the solar system, are they using the solar systems individually, or do they own a group farm?
It depends from country to country and from location to location. We have seen, for example, in Ethiopia, that farmers combine individually a solar system with drip. In other areas, there are small groups of farmers, 5 to 10, who collaboratively actually put up a loan or take a loan to invest in a solar system. So it really depends. There is no one model that fits all. And I think that's what makes farmer-led irrigation so interesting and also so complicated at the same time.
Right. One more quick question for you, Petra. Who is supporting communities for water accounting?
So, well, of course, we have to be a bit careful with the terminology, water accounting, and our different ways of doing that. At community level, actually, what we do much more than really water accounting is what we call citizen science. So where we actually, with communities, monitor the different resources. So we monitor water levels in the wells, we monitor, the water levels in the rivers, they measure the rainfall themselves, and they actually start seeing how much resources they have, not in the concrete accounting terminology as we researchers like to use or think about. And it does have some real great impacts by understanding really how their water levels fluctuate throughout the season or from year to year. Communities start adapting their overall governance systems. And I think that's the key. even if they might not have, calculated it to 2 decimals behind the comma.
Great, thank you, Petra. Also, I would like to let all attendees know, unfortunately, we do not have enough time to answer every question in the chat, but we will try to respond to those questions following the webinar, so keep them coming. Thank you. And now I have a question for our attendees. We have a polling question. If we have that up. As you'll see, the question is, what is the single largest barrier for sustainability of FLI in your country or setting? Please select the answer that fits your situation the best. And it looks like appropriate extension services and training on best agricultural water management practices is the most prevalent answer, followed closely by a lack of rules for managing water sustainably. Next, we have an open-ended question for attendees to answer, so please use your chat box for your response. What would it take, as in the specific kinds of partnerships, regulations, and investments, to establish effective multi-scale coordination around FLI that enables sustainable water use? Now I'll turn this question over to our panelists. Armand, what do you think it will take to establish effective multi-scale coordination for farmer-led irrigation?
Thank you very much. I think that to do so, it is very important to work around the enabling environment, also on the governance side, to ensure that there is a good public-private partnership, allowing the private sector to be better involved, and also to support the farmer to access the technology. Because this is one of the issues that we are addressing, like in West Africa. Okay. How to connect the farmer to the private sector, to the assets, the technology. Thank you.
Thank you, Armand. Petra, how about your perspective?
I fully agree with what Armand actually just elaborated on. And just to add on this, that we really need to look beyond the business as usual. And I think key to that is to really see how public and private financing can come together. Think about, for example, the sustainable financing or the climate financing, and how can that trigger not only, accelerated access to smallholder farmers, to those most vulnerable, but also how can that trigger really sustainable incentives. So there are different modalities that we will hear later, where private sector also can provide some incentives. So I think there is both a role for public and private sector to play, as aside from what I mentioned earlier in terms of data access and filling the data gaps.
Excellent input. Thank you both very much. It's been a great discussion. Our next presenters will focus on incentives and how they can be used to reduce over-abstraction. First is Shilp Verma, researcher with Water Energy Food Policy with IWMI. He manages the IWMI-TATA water policy program in India. Followed by Dave Daza, who will share his comments via a pre-recorded audio file. Dave's internet connection is a little tricky today. He's the regional representative of the Hans R. Neumann Foundation in Vietnam, and he'll be sharing his views on combating water scarcity in Vietnam's coffee sector through private sector initiatives. Then finally, we'll have Claudia Ringler, Deputy Division Director at the International Food Policy Research Institute and a flagship co-lead in the CGIAR research program on water, land, and ecosystems. She will present on collective games for groundwater management. Shilp, the virtual floor is all yours.
Thanks, Molly, and welcome everyone. I see that there's a lot of enthusiastic participation from India. And I already see some of the discussion going on, and I'm hopefully going to address some of it. Obviously, I'm going to talk about India and the specific case of the expansion of solar irrigation in India. Many of you know, I don't need to go into the details. India has a huge groundwater irrigation economy. The first map shows that each red dot here represents 5,000 groundwater structures. The second map shows what we in IWMI call the energy divide. The red sections of the map are basically the areas where more than 80% of the groundwater structures use electricity to pump groundwater. The yellow parts are where less than 20% are electric. And most of these electric structures get electricity either for free or at highly subsidized prices. And the result of this is shown in the third map, where we have these pockets of severe groundwater depletion. Now, the nature of solar technology is such that you need to have a high capital investment upfront, but after that, there is hardly any running cost. And that basically means that solar pumps might start acting the same way as free power has done, and it might lead to the same result, making groundwater depletion or sustainability even more problematic. So basically, India's example is probably the world's largest farmer-led irrigation development experience, because 98% of these 20 million structures that we have are financed by private farmers' capital. And there are many lessons to come from India for the rest of the world, especially in terms of farmer-led irrigation development. Some do's and probably several don'ts. Next slide, please. So what we did, since we wanted to come up with a model, clearly promoting solar energy is excellent from the energy point of view. What we wanted was, we wanted to come up with a model which is also groundwater benign. So we worked with a small group of 9 farmers in a village in central Gujarat. And what we did was we gave them irrigation pumps, well, solar irrigation pumps of 5 to 10 kilowatt size, not very large pumps. But we also organized these farmers into a solar cooperative. And we connected them to each other and at a single point to the main grid. And then we got these solar cooperative into a 25-year power purchase agreement with the local utility. Basically, what that meant was that now these farmers have a choice. They can either use the energy that they're generating on their fields to pump groundwater, or if they want, they can evacuate it to the grid and earn some income directly from it. Now, the premise behind is that farmers' demand for water as well as for energy is an indirect demand. The farmers are neither interested in energy nor in water. What they want to do with it is to generate some income out of it. And if they could do it directly by selling the surplus solar power, they would not have to deplete the solar aquifer, the groundwater aquifer. So basically, our argument here was that solar power is the best third crop that a farmer can grow, and hence the title of this project, Solar Power as a Remunerative Crop. Next, please. So what has happened since we did this small pilot in 2016 with 9 farmers is that it received a lot of positive attention from other farmers, from media. There were many officials from the government who visited this pilot and talked to these farmers. And the government of Gujarat, which is the state where we piloted this, got inspired by it, and they announced a scheme, statewide scheme, to solarize electric pumps in a similar way. It's called the Surya Shakti Kisan Yojana, or SKY for short, and already 3,500 farmers have been solarized in this way. This style of solarization of agriculture is now also part of Government of India's PM Kusum scheme, which is a very ambitious, around $20 billion US program to add about 3.5 million solar pumps on the ground over the next few years. Now, there are certain things that we have already learned from the pilot, and that means that we already know from field studies that off-grid SIPs extract much more groundwater than their diesel pump owning or electricity pump owning counterparts. But the grid-connected SIPs in IWMI's small pilot, those 9 farmers, they evacuated 2/3 of the power that they generated, and they could do their own irrigation with just 1/3 of the power. And they earned as much from solar as they were earning from crops. And 30% they were using 30% less energy than the average farmer there. What we don't know is whether these kind of fabulous numbers will hold once this is going on scale. And we are working now in Gujarat to make sure that we know that. We also don't know whether large farmers would respond differently. We have so far been working with small farmers. But most importantly, we would like to know whether this can become the first part of a larger groundwater demand management strategy. So in the end, my conclusion is that solar pumps are here to stay. They're going to completely reconfigure South Asia's water energy food nexus. And through our work, IWMI is trying to make sure that this change is for the better. Thank you.
Shilp, thank you very much for your great presentation and excellent examples. I would like to remind attendees, if you have questions on any of the presentations, please put your question in the chat and we will select a couple after these presentations to have them address. And next we will have Dave's pre-recorded presentation.
Today, I would like to share with you the results of a public-private partnership program with a focus on water management in the Vietnamese coffee sector. This program was co-financed by Nestlé and more in particular the Nescafé brand, together with the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. The program was implemented by the Neumann Foundation in partnership with the Vietnamese Ministry for Agriculture and Rural Development. The total value was about $2.2 million spread over 5 years, and this was equally shared between the public and the private partners. Now let me start by giving you a little bit of a background on this project. It is important to know that Vietnam is the second coffee producer worldwide after Brazil. This explains the interest of the private partner, Nestlé, as a major coffee buyer in Vietnam. However, coffee production here is at a serious risk because of seasonal water scarcity. In order to reach yields of up to 4 metric tons per hectare, which is very high compared to the global average of about 1 metric ton per hectare, irrigation is necessary to trigger the blossoming of the coffee trees. Now, what we observe in the field is that currently the farmers are excessively irrigating, up to 1,000 liters per tree per irrigation round, while we have empirical evidence that this can be reduced by 40 to 60%. This would not affect the yield, and this would not affect the coffee quality. Now, if we would do so, farmers could save a lot in terms of energy and labor costs. Now, given that today's webinar focuses on water, I think it is important to give a little more information on the irrigation system in the coffee sector in Vietnam. About 66% of the farmers are using hose irrigation. Each coffee tree is planted in a small micro basin and irrigated individually. You can compare this with watering your flowers at home. Each farmer is investing privately. So there is the initial investment for digging a shallow well, and then they need a pump and a number of tubes. Water is mainly extracted underground, and it does not have a price if you are not connected to an irrigation supply grid. So as such, the cost for irrigation consists only of energy and labor. Now, to come back to the project, the target was to train and raise awareness on good irrigation practices for 50,000 farmers, and then to have about 60% adopt these practices. We convinced about 53% of the project beneficiaries to apply proper irrigation practices. As a consequence, we can save about 32% of water. What does this mean in economic terms? Let's look at the lower right graph. We invested $2.2 million and compared to the situation before the project start, generated about $8.4 million in terms of energy and labor cost saving for the farmers. Now, what have we learned? First, it is important to collect measurable data, both at the field extraction level and at the landscape level. By the start of the project, we conducted short interviews with farmers and realized that most of them either did not recall irrigation volumes applied or just gave us a recommended value, assuming that we were auditors of a certification program. So we adjusted our monitoring approach and made on-farm water application measurements. Second, we changed our training approach. We started off with traditional farmer field schools, inviting about 30 farmers in a classroom, but soon realized that there was a training fatigue. Therefore, we decided to go to farmer coaching, whereby our team went out to meet farmers individually and coach them on the job not only about irrigation practices, but also to provide ad hoc advice on other farm management issues. Last but not least, I think it is important to better shape our messages to farmers to make them understand the socio-economic benefits of water saving and what this means in terms of net money saved in their pocket.
That was a great recorded presentation. A lot of food for thought there. Next, we have Claudia.
Yeah, thank you very much. So water is, as you've already heard, a common pool resource that is easily depleted if no effective coordination exists among users to regulate withdrawals. Overuse of groundwater resources is particularly challenging as declines are not directly visible. Moreover, with many users sharing the same resource, often unknown to each other, stopping overuse is difficult, especially when it is more profitable to irrigate highly water consumptive crops, as several of you have already remarked in the chat function. The problem is particularly acute in India, where more than 85% of domestic water and over 60% of food production depend on groundwater, and about half of all wells show falling water tables. Because the economic impacts of water scarcity are large and growing, the government of India is putting water security increasingly at the forefront of its development agenda. Shilp already suggested a solution for falling water tables for India by selling solar power to the electric grid, and Dave for Vietnam by coaching farmers on coffee water requirements. There are many other technical tools, such as crop water budgeting, that can be highly effective, but their uptake has been low and impacts limited. And blueprint top-down rules generally do not change water users' behavior. There is, however, strong evidence that effective community rules and their enforcement can motivate better water use behavior. The question is then how coordination rules and behavior can be promoted in a participatory way without external imposition and in a low-cost manner that supports large-scale implementation. IFPRI has been working with the Foundation for Ecological Security, or FES, a large Indian NGO, to pilot experiential games in 20 communities in Andhra Pradesh with support from the CGR research program on water, land, and ecosystems. The social learning intervention consisted of experimental games where farmers choose between water-intensive and water-conserving crops, and water tables changed based on their choices. Varying rainfall based on the rolling of a dice and the need to provide water for domestic uses was also considered in the games. The second part of the intervention is a group discussion of the results to derive learnings for farmers going forward themselves. One of the group discussions is shown here on the pictures that you see with the results of the game on the cardboard wall. The social intervention significantly improved the understanding of how groundwater drawdown occurs and increase the adoption of rules for groundwater management in villages with the social learning interventions compared to villages where these interventions did not take place. FES has since expanded these social learning tools to 200 additional villages and 14,000 households, and the project supported by the German government that started this year will further scale out these tools to 150,000 households in 7 Indian states, working with FES, ICRISAT, and Indian government partners. Next slide, please. What's the situation in sub-Saharan Africa? While most agriculture areas in that region remain rain-fed, the potential for groundwater irrigation is large, and small-scale irrigation has rapidly increased in many countries in the region. For example, by 0.5 million hectares in Ethiopia in just 10 years. And this is a picture from Ethiopia. As in South Asia, groundwater governance remains a challenge in the region, and lack of groundwater institutions increases uncertainty and risk, and thus reduces incentives of farmers to invest, as well as incentives in the private sector to develop effective technology supply chains. To explore the potential of community management of groundwater resources in Africa, IFPRI is testing social learning interventions for groundwater governance in Ethiopia and Ghana, building on the Indian experience, under the USAID-supported Innovation Lab for Small-Scale Irrigation, and also works on institutions under the DFID-funded REACH project. How do social learning interventions fit in with the other tools proposed here today? Our experience has shown that they are an important component in the water management toolbox, but not a panacea on their own. They work best in smaller, confined aquifer areas where changes in community behavior can affect water tables. They also require that farmers have the opportunity to self-manage resources, and they work better in more homogeneous communities. Other pieces that go well with social learning interventions, at least in India, are the development of crop budgets and watershed rehabilitation interventions. We do very much hope that many more NGOs and governments will pilot these tools going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Our presenters provided great examples on how to provide individual as well as communal incentives to improve water use on farm, reduce overpumping, and support collective community governance. Insightful presentations for sure. We've selected a couple of questions from our audience. The first one is for Shilp. There were several questions about the experience described around setting the electricity price right, changes in cropping patterns, or potentially unintended consequences. With three options for incomes from the solar energy, that's selling power, selling farm produce, or selling water, don't you think there are some dynamics around the model remaining groundwater benign? So one would expect certain controls on the returns from each of these three options around solar pumps. Perhaps, could I get your input on that, Shilp?
Thank you. That's a lot. I don't know how much of it I can answer. Sure. I mean, it's still early days. What we have is only data from 9 farmers. And that too, most of the data that we have is looking at their energy behavior. I think as sky is unfolding in Gujarat and more farmers are adopting it, we are every day getting new data, and some of our hypotheses might prove to be right, and some of them we might prove them to be wrong, and then I think the scheme will have to evolve accordingly. But we can't say either way conclusively. However, the results from the pilot were definitely encouraging. And specifically on the question of the 3 options, I think that what we want farmers to do is not stop agriculture. What we want them to do is to invest energy and water in agriculture till the level of efficiency. And it's the excess beyond efficiency irrigation that we want them to check. And I think that this model provides those incentives. Whether or not it actually happens, we will wait and see. Thank you.
Thank you, Shilp. And Dave, I'm not sure you'll be able to answer using the audio. Perhaps you could use your chat. A question for you is, how do you guard against over-abstraction of groundwaters by the coffee farmers?
Hi, good morning, good evening, everybody. I think it's difficult to control. In Vietnam, farmers are basically free to irrigate, to drill their own wells. So we do not have enough data at the moment to really understand the water, the water balance at the watershed level. I think this refers back to Petra's presentation. There is need for more monitoring of water at the landscape level and at the farm level.
That worked well, Dave. Thank you. And a question for Claudia. Can you give some additional details on what social learning interventions were made?
Yeah, so I tried to put it in, and there are, of course, a lot of online materials and papers that I think should be already available on the website linked to this event. So it's basically a game actually played separately with women and men farmers about planting different crops. So farmers chose the crop that they were interested to plant, then associated water use was calculated by the facilitators and the groundwater table declined. Next season, the farmers could change the crop. There was a rolling of the dice to understand what the rainfall would be, but the rainfall was only determined after the farmers decided which crop they wanted to irrigate, and then domestic uses were also considered. And so playing various rounds of the games, the farmers, women and men farmers separately understood what it really meant to have various irrigating crops, rainfall, and domestic uses all interact and affect the groundwater tables. And the second part of the intervention, so that was the game itself. The second part was a group discussion where farmers exchanged their experiences on how groundwater tables developed in their own games. And then basically decided to come up themselves. Mental models started to change, and they realized that it might be helpful in some cases to develop some groundwater institutions in terms of, if there was no rainfall in the previous seasons, okay, let's change our cropping patterns, or let's make sure we can always meet domestic water demands, etc. So they came up with their own rules in those villages where the games were played. So it's a really straightforward, no technology requiring intervention that can relatively easily be scaled out. Thank you.
Claudia, thank you. That's a great example of that local connection and making it all local to make it work. Next, we have a polling question. This is for you, our attendees. What is the single most effective approach towards sustainability in your country or your setting? And obviously there are several approaches that can be effective, but from your responses, farmer-driven pilots and other peer-to-peer learning, it is expressed as the key, one of the top keys in helping support farmer-led irrigation. So thank you for participating in the poll. Now we have a text question for you. What do you find is the most promising approach that you've seen that could reduce incentives for over-abstraction? And now I'd like to share that same question with all of our panelists. Let's begin with you, Shilp.
Thanks. Well, there isn't, I don't think there's one approach. It really depends on the context. But in India, what we've seen is that several approaches have been tried. Using energy as a handle to incentivize pumping behavior hasn't worked on a large scale. But on a small scale, what has worked is organizing farmers and then trying to convince them to take steps as a group rather than make decisions individually. Thanks.
Thank you, Shilp. How about you, Dave?
Thank you, Molly. I think the most important thing to do is really to get our messaging out right to the farmers. I try to show that in my presentation. If farmers understand that they can save on energy and labor costs, they will most likely use less water. So I think that's the most important thing we need to do. I think it's also important that we adopt our training approach. As I mentioned, bringing farmers together in a classroom, having a little example in the field is not enough. I think we have to reach out to the individuals and show them how you can do things in a more economically viable way.
Thank you, Dave. That makes sense. Claudia, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, much has already been said and written in the chat box, but as maybe just to say again, as water is a common pool resource with many farmers drawing on the exact same resource, it's very important that farmers gain an understanding of basic understanding of how groundwater systems work to help themselves change their mental models and adapt their management practices, and basic groundwater institutions and rules that farmers can develop themselves, I believe are the most sustainable tools that are out there. If there are technologies that can further support that, like monitoring wells, any information tools that they can then also look at to see how their own behavior change has impacted sustainability of groundwater tables. So I think that would also be useful. But what we really need at the core is mental models of farmers that are geared towards sustainability, and that they are there. They just have to be brought to the open. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. Armand, how about you? Any innovative approaches to helping reduce over abstraction?
I think that much has been already said by other colleagues. Yeah, capacity building is very important. Okay, it is very important to reflect also about what crop we put in place, and also technology like the drip irrigation is very important as well.
Armand, thank you. And Petra, so we can have everyone.
Thanks, Molly. I think indeed a lot has been said. And I think the key is that we always need to find contextually relevant solutions. I think that's what I see throughout all the different speakers. So it's about making sure that in a specific country, we do understand the context and we find the right incentives that fit that context, and that we don't see one particular thing that works well in one site as a silver bullet for all the different sites. I think that's key.
Thank you, Petra. Our next experts will discuss ways to ensure inclusive water access. First is Barbara van Koppen. She's the theme coordinator on multiple use water services in the Rural Water Supply Network and IMI emeritus scientist. She'll speak on securing everyone's water needs and ensuring inclusive access. Followed by Sarah Keener, Senior Social Development Specialist at the Water Global Practice of the World Bank Group, sharing issues for gender inclusive approaches to water and agriculture. Barbara, would you like to begin?
Thank you, Molly. Thanks. Welcome, everybody. How can accelerating farmer-led irrigation development secure all water needs in an inclusive manner and at scale? To answer this question, let me unravel community perspectives, as in this picture, and then starting with people's multiple uses. The woman that you see in this picture will probably use the water pumped not only for irrigating crops and vegetables for consumption and sale. She will also use it for drinking, cooking, cleaning utensils, cleaning the house, laundry, bathing, and with the COVID-19 crisis, hopefully also for hand washing. And she may give water to her goats and chickens. I guess everyone in this webinar would prioritize domestic water uses for everyone. Access to water for drinking is a human right. And the water sanitation and hygiene, or the WASH sector, including the Rural Water Supply Network, strives to be inclusive at scale and aims at universal coverage, leaving no one behind. This sector also reaches the poorer or lower caste households within villages, or pastoralist, fisher communities, or other marginalized groups. And all these people also need water for productive uses. Even landless households can irrigate nutritious crops and vegetables on their homesteads and keep livestock for eggs and milk. So can more collaboration between the irrigation and the WASH sectors better secure all water needs at scale? Yes, and multi-purpose infrastructure is one way to achieve that. As in the picture, multi-purpose infrastructure is normal for communities, especially at and near homesteads. The ability to use infrastructure for multiple purposes means multiple incentives to invest. And income from irrigation pays for the infrastructure and can help achieving universal coverage. Interestingly, the technologies promoted in farmer-led irrigation development and in the WASH sector's promotion of self-supply are exactly the same. The same drilling, same wells or boreholes, pipes, same manual, mechanized or solar pumps, rainwater harvesting or retention and recharge of aquifers. Both sectors seek to set up sustainable supply chains for simple, market-based, affordable and repairable technologies, SMART in short. They both focus on training artisans and on other collaboration with the local and international private sector and financing facilities to reach scale. And for the design of financing models, the bottom line remains that the incremental costs to change a single-use infrastructure design into a multi-purpose design, for example, by widening the pipes, the costs are low, but the incremental benefits are high. So small investments can have big benefits. And another form of cross-sectoral collaboration is sharing expertise. For example, the WASH sector has vital expertise in point-of-use treatment to ensure that the 3 to 5 liters per person per day for drinking are safe. And such practices can be useful wherever people have to drink from irrigation canal or other unsafe sources. And the other way around, expertise in seed varieties, crop water requirements, inputs or market access, and the sad changes now under the COVID crisis but that expertise can contribute to the wash sector's promotion of self-supply for domestic and productive uses at scale. Then the next slide recaps the two earlier points and moves to the multiple water sources shared by all. And the earlier presentations already highlighted the importance of preventing pollution and using as little water as possible. However, seasonally or permanently, sooner or later, or already now, the boundaries of the available water resources are reached, and competition becomes inevitable. And competition is between people, each with multiple water needs, but with very unequal powers to invest in infrastructure to take water. So when groundwater levels drop, those with the deeper boreholes keep ahead of the race. And the shallow wells of women and the poor are the first to fall dry. Studies on the distribution of water resources confirm immense inequalities. The few large-scale users take up most water, and the aggregate volumes of all other users can still be a small fraction only. So, securing all water needs at scale requires not only accelerating multi-purpose infrastructure development, but also an absolute priority in water resources allocation to meet everyone's core minimum rights to water and to food. In other words, enough for all forever. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. And next is Sarah.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. In regions such as Africa and South Asia, over 40% of farmers are women. It's also been well documented that women are less likely to benefit from technology and productive inputs, depressing their agricultural productivity by 20 to 30% compared to male farmers. This is obviously a real concern for food security. So when we talk about how to scale up farmer-led irrigation, it's clear that focusing specifically on female farmers will be key to overall success. So what does this mean? First, there's much that we already know about the gender divide. We know that within households, the roles governing who produces and markets which crops, who takes the lead in managing cash, whose name assets are in, and therefore who can access finance for purchasing things like solar pumps, and who takes priority in using technology within the home is heavily influenced by social and cultural norms, and also by the regulatory environment which the farmer finds herself. And the thing that we need to understand about these social norms is that these roles are internalized, so enforced by women as much as men. So they're not changed overnight. We also know that extension agents in regions as different as Eastern Europe and Africa will tend to interact more frequently with male family members. When husbands don't fully pass this information on to their wives, this leads to inefficiencies, particularly if the crop most likely to benefit from irrigation are those cultivated by women. And we know that an important part of scaling up is to decentralize digital monitoring and user feedback of sustainable groundwater extraction. However, there are 300 million fewer women accessing mobile internet than men, and we've got to remember that in low-income sub-Saharan Africa, only 58% of women were literate in 2018. So if women cannot receive information on sustainability or feedback on local water abstraction, or engage in digital monitoring, or share their own knowledge on resource use, sustainability cannot be achieved under farmer-led irrigation. Beyond the household, scaling up also involves being able to interact up the value chain in two important ways. First, being able to negotiate effectively and participate in the private sector, which tends to be male-dominated at higher levels of the value chain. We know, for example, that female-owned firms are on average smaller and more informal. It also requires being able to engage effectively with farmer associations or networks, which can improve access to finance and facilitate exchange of information, which can be important in convincing female farmers to change practices or access technology, and in some cases to take on increased risk. The demonstration effect is real. For example, one study in Tanzania showed that farmers who were a member of a water association were 31% more likely to adopt farmer-led irrigation. However, data from many countries shows that women are not well represented in existing networks, water associations, and farmer organizations. And even where they manage to achieve some representation, in many countries with conservative gender norms, they tend to sit back, don't speak, or don't express opinions in opposition to those expressed by men. In one word association in Ecuador, which is typical, when they tracked it, women spoke 3 minutes compared to 28 for men. So while they participate, they often don't have the power to set agendas. So it's not about what we know, but about what we do. Next slide, please. There are many options, but here are 4 to consider. First, we need to address the information asymmetry, including on sustainability in this increasingly digital context. Some examples of how this can be improved include investing in participatory monitoring of groundwater, specifically targeting women, to raise awareness of the interaction with sustainability and use, while making an effort to target training of women on the technology side where feasible. Leverage interactive radio programs such as farm radio to target women and to provide two-way radio that can amplify their voice and knowledge on resource use and sustainability. Programs like this have a track record of effectively reaching female farmers. Second, we need to engage NGOs or others to help facilitate connections with the private sector, which otherwise might not consider women as primary clients of support. And we also need to support female entrepreneurship, for example, in solar, which has been done extensively in the energy sector. Third, we need to begin to measure the problem in voice, going from organizations at the bottom all the way up to more formal organizations governing water allocation, both in terms of participation, but also in terms of representation and leadership. There is no systematic data on this now. We're tracking this in other areas such as utilities. Why not here? Further, quotas for female representation in formal water or farmer organizations, while not sufficient, have had some impact in local government bodies in India, particularly when they increase female representation and leadership. Finally, we need to continue regulatory reforms that have been ongoing to allow for independent or joint land title, or to remove requirements of land ownership as a prerequisite to membership to organizations or to access finance. Again, farmer-led irrigation cannot be effectively scaled up or sustainably scaled up without engaging female farmers, and doing so requires explicit action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you both for the points that you raised. It is extremely important to ensure that as we scale farmer-led irrigation, we prioritize domestic water needs and ensure that women are included at all levels of water governance. We have selected questions from our attendees. Barbara, this one is for you. Who is best seated to prioritize and monitor fair water allocation?
Thank you. I saw that spot-on question. It is, I think, both the community and the government as duty bearer, the state. For the community, we can build on sharing principles since time immemorial. Water scarcity is not new. Of course, it becomes very different now. But there have been principles of norms. This is my land, this is our village, or water is a bit more ours than yours. But I've invested in the storage, so that water is a bit more mine. First come, first serve, transfers, marriage, inheritance, etc. So there is a lot to build on in the villages, but there is also a lot of hierarchy, of course. Certainly gender, and especially the problem that men monopolize technology. I think women's exclusion from controlling technology is a major gender issue in the water sector. So to overcome these hierarchies, the states, the public sector has a role, to enforce the constitutional rights to water and food. So enough for all forever, and then sit with communities bottom up, build on what there is, and very much look at the enormous inequalities in distribution of water use. There are not many studies as yet, but we find Gini coefficients of 0.96, etc. If we really look at who is using how much water, so quantification and awareness raising on that as well. Thanks.
Barbara, thank you. The next question is for Sarah. In which ways can women's groups and entrepreneurship work directly with the private sector? Maybe you have an example of that you could share.
Yes, thank you very much. There are a number of examples of this that we can see from the energy sector with the transition to low carbon, where there have been supports. There's a number of programs that specifically support female entrepreneurs. They help smaller female businesses move up sort of the chain of formality and provide support for them. There are ways to also look at social procurement in terms of incentivizing contracting of female entrepreneurs where there is contracting done by specific bodies. And then there's also models that have been tested on social investing and social bonds that basically also help provide support and extra incentives for female entrepreneurs. But where you see this a lot is in solar, where you have explicit focus on training female entrepreneurs to engage in solar marketing of solar goods, and this has been done extensively in the energy sector. We can share some examples offline.
Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate that. And we have our final polling question, which is, what is the single largest barrier for inclusive water access for FLI in your country or your setting? And obviously there are several barriers, but in our poll, technologies that support richer farmers more seems to be the most prevalent answer. Thank you for sharing your input on the poll. And next we have our open text question. Please provide your answer in the chat box. What do you see as the most promising approach to promote inclusive access to FLI in your setting? And now I'll turn this over to you, Barbara. What do you see as the most promising approach to promote inclusive access to FLI?
It would be multi-purpose and especially around homesteads. If it is a distant field, it can be a single use of the technology, but they should be cheap. They should be really affordable, which is a lot of training, and then also for women. So again, getting the technology, getting access to the water first, because the poorest don't even have that. And then it gets to competition for water. I wouldn't talk about sustainability. I would talk about the inevitable competition at some stage and really look at the enormous differences. Some people use water for golf courses and other people don't even have water for basic nutritious food. So quantify and realize that competition is between people, each with multiple water needs. So overcome the sectoral silos as well.
Great, Barbara, thank you. How about you, Sarah?
Hi, I think it's extremely important to address the issue of voice and representation. As we had discussed, at the same time, one of the things that is important to point out is that based on some research like Neumann is doing in India, even when women become part of leadership, so when they become part of chairpersons in districts in India, they tend to redirect public investments towards programs that increase women's opportunity. For example, having communal wells as opposed to near their house, as opposed to having piped systems that you have to pay for. So while they tend to promote investments that would favor gender equality a priori, they do not necessarily promote investments that are sustainable. So it's a combination of governance, voice, and leadership, but also information. So engaging women and others in the discussion on what is sustainability and the types of feedback loops that would allow them to better understand that.
Thank you, Sarah. Fantastic discussion, ladies. Please welcome Joy Busolo, Senior Water Resources Management Specialist with the World Bank Group, for concluding remarks. Joy?
Thank you, Molly. I would like to thank all the speakers for their great presentations and the valuable lessons and experiences that they've shared today. The webinar focused on accelerating inclusive farmer-led irrigation development to reach scale. However, we realize that care must be taken to do it in an inclusive and sustainable manner. The series today offered the following key messages. First is that technical tools are important, but must be accompanied by incentives for behavioral change toward more efficient water use, behavior, and local norms. We learned that enforcing rules based on community coordination and a participatory approach can be effective at inducing efficient behavior among water users, as opposed to the traditional top-down approach. In this session, we saw the value of social learning interventions and other low-cost support systems for improved water resources management, even on a large scale. We also saw that developing and providing incentives would most likely require a combination of public and private actors coming together for such provision, as well as the availability of reliable data. And this brings me to the second message, which is that data measurement and collection is critical. It goes without saying that addressing information asymmetry on the sustainable use of water resources and of productive services is critical to scaling inclusive farmer-led irrigation development sustainably and reducing risks. For example, we still need to further test assumptions on water users' efficient behavior in order to determine whether models can be scaled up. We also need to collect more comparative data in terms of volumes of water saved by different models and incentives. Additionally, more understanding is needed on how such models and incentives affect water markets and choice of crops, as well as the impact of such choices on the availability of water resources. Better collection and harmonization of local data and information only underlies the need for collaboration and coordination among sector stakeholders. And this brings me to my third and final key message. Scaling inclusive farmer-led irrigation development sustainably requires collective action and an integrated multi-scale approach. As we have seen, many water users sharing their resource remain unknown to each other, resulting in issues of representation and voice, whether in terms of engaging with farmer associations or women. This session has been clear on the need for different sectors and stakeholders to learn from each other. The idea is that doing so would foster an inclusive ecosystem that enables and is conducive to the formation and implementation of policies, plans, and interventions for the sustainable scaling of farmer-led irrigation development. This inclusivity demands us to step out of our silos and demands collective action among sectors and stakeholders alike. In addition to the agriculture and irrigation sectors, we are looking at other water-related sectors such as health and WASH. With regard to stakeholders, this includes governments, private sector, and civil society actors such as farmer organizations. As it was earlier suggested in the session, such partnership will make it possible for us to influence water resources management and regulatory bodies at a more formal level. Based on the presentations as well, special mention must be made about private sector engagement and private capital investments in the farmer-led irrigation space. As we all know, private sector engagement and private capital investments could fill gaps, especially in innovative financing and creative technology solutions, as well as data collection. So looking forward and looking at these three key messages, the need for incentives for behavioral change, data measurement and collective action, then we ask ourselves, what next for scaling inclusive farmer-led irrigation development sustainably? How can we move forward? Perhaps the final point could offer as a first step forward, collective action among sectors and stakeholders to provide incentives, as well as facilitate the collection and harmonization of data and information for sustainable water resource management. But this is not an end in itself. I would like to conclude by sharing that at the 2030 Water Resources Group, working to unite diverse groups with a common interest in the sustainable management of water through establishment of multi-stakeholder platforms is at the very core of what we do. Multi-stakeholder platforms provide a mechanism to advance collective action for water resources management. And for example, in the area of farmer-led irrigation, 2030 Water Resources Group has been able to support the province of Karnataka in India to facilitate the drip-to-market agriculture corridor in Ramthal, which is one of the largest automated drip irrigation projects and the first of its kind in India. The project has helped reduce water used for agriculture by up to 40% and is being scaled in several other districts. Other examples, as mentioned by the other speakers, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in Eastern Africa, several partners across different sectors, including governments, financial institutions, equipment providers, have come together and continue to innovate in irrigation financing for small-scale farmers, leveraging market linkages and partnership models to increase access to finance for irrigation. We also heard from other speakers of similar examples of partnerships and platforms, for example, in Ethiopia, Burkina Faso, and Vietnam. And we could go on and share more examples not covered today. But because of time, I'd like to stop here and thank you very much. Back to you, Molly.
Joy, thank you for that excellent summary. As this webinar has highlighted, although there isn't a single silver bullet solution Through collective action, we can find innovative and inclusive ways to encourage farmer-led irrigation practices at scale and in a sustainable manner. Thank you all very much for your time and expertise today. We will continue to focus on this topic in future events and invite you to keep the conversation alive by posting on your own social media platforms using the hashtag farmer-led irrigation. Thank you all very much. Have a great day or a great evening.